George Galloway, and the mother of all talk shows. Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway.
The wife of Zelensky spends $1 million on Cartier jewelry in New York City during the recent United Nations Jamboree. A Marie Antoinette moment that speaks volumes about her, about them, and about the way that this is all going to end. And secrecy and lawfare is breaking out everywhere. The laws of innocence until proven guilty, the laws of sub judice, the right of free men and women to speak their minds within the law are all now under savage assault on both sides of the Atlantic and also here in the United Kingdom. And the war is petering out pitifully, but with the death of hundreds of thousands of poor Ukrainians sent to their demise on behalf of an empire which is rapidly turning its back upon them. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night because it's the mother of all talk shows.
Curious about our curriculum? Have something to say? Then call us now to join the debate on the mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway, the mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway, the world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
According to the respected United States publication The Nation, Mrs. Zelensky, during the recent visit to New York, spent $1 million in one shop on one set of items, namely jewelry. Cartier in New York City, we've seen the receipts, more than $1 million on jewelry. That is quite a shopping spree. Assuming that she didn't only go into one shop and assuming she didn't only buy jewelry, I think we are looking at a massive series of expenditures of other people's money, the Ukrainian people's money, the British and American, French and German taxpayers from every country in the coalition of the killing that is driving this conflict in Ukraine and forbidding it to come to a negotiated ending. That tells you two things. It tells you that there are greedy bastards who are ready to fill their own pockets, their own shoes, their own boots, their own bank accounts, their own multi-platform property empire throughout several countries. But it also tells you that they are nearing the end. Nobody spends $1 million on jewelry if they're not expecting to need that jewelry for the future, if they are not expecting a future in Ukraine. That, it seems obvious to me, may well be obvious to you. Everyone is turning against them. There are reports this evening that Macron and Schultz are no longer on speaking terms, cannot bear to be in the same room as each other. Schultz has just had to face a public opinion poll which shows that his government of cranks and quacks and greenery fanatics is going down to a humiliating landslide defeat in the next German general election. About 15% of respondents are minded to vote for little soldier Schultz. Unbelievably, bonkers Baerbock, his Green Party partner in power, gets 18%, 3% more than him. But either way you look at it, these two are out of office and soon. Now, in Germany in particular, I can't say in France, because I've spent some considerable time there this year, and never been harassed in any way as to my points of view, how I express them, and on what platform I express them. But try doing so in Germany. Germany is now a police state, although not a police state efficient enough to stop a savage assault on one of the leaders of the German opposition, the right-wing AfD, who's in hospital right now, having been savagely assaulted in the street. The family of his deputy leader has been taken for safety to Switzerland. Germany is breaking down. Germany is in dire straits, economically, politically, and in terms of democracy. In Germany, it is literally a crime to make fun of a German minister if that satire is hampering them from carrying out their duties. And if it wasn't, then it wouldn't be satire. Satire is dead in Germany. And if you think I'm making that up, I have personally met someone arrested by police turning up mob-handed with weapons at his house and at his elderly mother's house in order to effect the arrest. In Germany, that happens. It's happened historically. But in Britain, it hasn't before now happened. In Britain, we fought and for a time stood alone against that kind of police state. It was fear of such a Gestapo which fortified the British people in 1940 and 1941 when for a short time, but a crucial time, a time that changed the world, we stood alone with our Commonwealth allies and some who had fled from Nazi-occupied countries. And if we had not stood, there would have been no more Second World War, even before Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, got underway. In Britain, it was fear of the midnight knock on the door, the dawn raid. In Britain, it was the fear of a demand for our papers in the street for no reason, with no due cause. No cause to show, just show your papers to anyone in uniform. No crime of speaking freely. No crime of standing up for what you believe in, whether it's right or whether it's wrong. No cancellation of elections. Elections took place in Britain throughout the entirety of the Second World War. And it was our belief in Britain that we would never have this kind of police state, which certainly was held by the vast majority of members of Parliament during the nearly 30 years in which I sat in the House of Commons. That no longer exists. That Britain has gone. There are reports, I'm trying to get to the bottom of them, of a blogger in Bristol on air having his house raided by police officers, several of them, when presumably there's crime in Bristol that could be being investigated because of what he was saying. Your house raided by police because of what you are saying, not what you are doing, not what you're encouraging other people to do. In this case, the man was talking about the Sieg Heiling jack booting in the Canadian Parliament, something which I did myself. What's that noise at the door? Are we really going quietly into that good night where an unknown vlogger with scarcely any audience at all can be raided by the police because he's talking about high-heeled Jack Trudeau, Sieg Heiling, an SS veteran, in the audience of the Canadian Parliament? Seriously? Is that the Britain we want to live in? That our grandfathers fought so that we might not. I see another case today. I'm cheery of even raising it because I don't know what the status is of a very well-known person, the leader of a British political party, a famous thespian who talks a lot of bollocks from time to time, raided by 5 police officers today in a London in the grip of a knife and gun crime wave where children are not safe to get on and off a school bus, where children are routinely murdered, in some cases by other children. Now, I don't know what the raid was all about. Let me say, right up top, if they're on their way to me now, I don't take drugs. I've never even seen drugs. I don't even drink alcohol. I abhor violence. I don't advocate the breaking of any laws or the destruction of any public property. But the mere act of talking about a phenomenon that everybody knows exists, namely the blade-running saboteurs who are damaging public property in their campaign against the ULEZ cameras in outer London, gets you a raid with 5 police officers? I very much hope not, Mr. Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, because at the very least, this is a grotesque waste of police resources at a time when the population of London is living in fear and alarm because of the armed criminals that are roaming, it would appear, almost every street. And of course, there's the double standard involved. A man called Chris Packham on BBC News talked about how it was time, as far as he was concerned, for law breaking. He said it, law breaking in defense of the latest quackery, the climate change campaign. Why are people allowed to break the law and advocate for others to break the law, to just stop oil, but other people are subject to a massive, overweening police raid on their private residence for advocating what it is that they have advocated? That's a quite spread in Britain. Even the Prime Minister of Great Britain, at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester, not only declared that a politician in Scotland had been charged when she hasn't, but convicted when she hasn't even been charged. This total irresponsibility, this total dereliction of basic principles of natural justice, of British justice, of the proprieties which people in his position are expected, rightly expected, to observe, has gone completely out of the window. He who shall not be named, for fear of algorithmic suppression of this show, and I'm not making that up, I cannot mention his name, because if I do, the audience of this show will be very substantially constricted by platforms on which it is being broadcast, has not been charged with any crime, let alone convicted of any crime, but has been deplatformed across most of the platforms he was previously broadcasting to millions of people about. It's not just him, it's them that have been told they can no longer watch this person who has not even been charged with a crime. That's the madness which has taken grip of our society. And of course, it could happen to anybody. It might one day even happen to you. You have to stand up for everybody's right to speak, or else forfeit the right yourself one day, perchance, to speak your own truth to an audience that wants to hear you. The leader of the Slovakian government, the new Prime Minister of Slovakia, who's just won a general election on a platform: no more war, no more money for the war, no more weapons to the war. The people voted for him, elected him. Then all the envelopes started coming in from the other ruling political parties in the European Union, like him, fellow European Union leaders. And when he opened the envelopes, there was no congratulations therein. There was threats and blackmail and demands that he recant on everything he said in order to get elected, that he implement the reverse of what the people of Slovakia have just voted for in the last few days. Poland is out under pressure in an upcoming Polish election. The Polish government is washing its hands with the Ukraine problem. Not just on weapons, but on the economy, on migration, on the use of Poland as the conduit for every mercenary crackerjack on his way for $1,500 a day to get himself killed on the Ukrainian steppe at the onset of winter. The Polish government is no longer prepared to cooperate with the Zelensky regime. And even more seriously, the Ukrainian forces, more than 10,000 of them now, have taken advantage of a hotline set up by Russia through which they can surrender safely and have no more part of the war. This war, as every single heavyweight newspaper and commentator knows, though only some of them have had the honesty to share that knowledge with their readers, viewers, and listeners, everybody knows this war has been lost. That when the Russians advance, they will advance exactly as far as they want to advance. That the counter-offensive, expensively purchased in blood and treasure, has been a complete failure. And yet still, we have psychopaths like BenWallace of Balaclava saying that one more push, the Ukrainians can do it. Give them the tools, as Sunak said today, and the Ukrainians will finish the job. They're all lying. And moreover, they know that you know that they're all lying. But they simply cannot stop this stream of excrescence that spews from within them. Because, of course, when the Ukrainian resistance collapses, they're all going to be exposed as the liars that took your money, took your freedoms, took away your legal protections from state policing for political purposes. It's going to be a bumpy night. You better fasten your seatbelt. It's the mother of all talk shows. Thank you. Go ahead.
During your show in the past, you've often mentioned that Donald Trump would be a much better alternative than Biden, although you weren't a big fan of him, etc. And you said that in all likeliness, if he gets in power, he'll be much more appeasing towards Putin. There'll be less likely of the conflict to escalate. But I have to tell you, I'm not so sure about that. Really, I think the only way to solve all this, it doesn't matter if Kenny gets in or anyone else, because there's always going to be, at one stage of our lifetime, two psychotic leaders of the superpowers. Why hasn't anyone in your show or yourself mentioned anything about nuclear disarmament or CND? Surely the only way to save humanity is by nuclear disarmament. And I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
Yeah, well, of course, but how are you going to get that? I mean, does CND even still exist? They could have been leafleting outside every cinema showing Oppenheimer. But of course, they don't have enough people to fill a telephone box. It is the worst example I know of, although the Stop the War Coalition runs it close, of an organization that for its sectarian, internal, political reasons has thrown away its brand. I have not appeared on a Stop the War platform for an entire decade. Not to worry, no to NATO, no to war. Its rival organization attracts exponentially larger numbers of people. They cannot help themselves, these people. These members of leftist groupuscles have it in their DNA that they cannot get along with anybody who isn't exactly like them. And as the number of people who are exactly like them is mercifully tiny, they end up in tiny organizations. So, of course, I'm in favor of the destruction of nuclear weapons. But how are you going to get that? It's a totally utopian slogan to advance at this point in time. I'm just trying to stop the weapons from being used.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
As I speak, I have just read that Scott Ritter, a regular guest on the mother of all talk shows, has again been banned by YouTube. His account closed. I'm almost speechless. Who will they be coming for next? Well, actually, not necessarily a user of Twitter, X, but the owner of Twitter, Elon Musk, is now subject to lawfare by the European Union, by several European governments, by the American government, by the President of the United States, who repeatedly threatens to investigate Musk, his business on Twitter and his other businesses. Why? Because Musk is against him. Because Musk has declared he's going to vote for Trump, the ultimate lawfare case, rather than Biden. And he's not going to allow the FBI and the CIA to run his public square, which is what Twitter always purported to be. I give fair warning that I myself am in a legal case against the old Twitter, which unfortunately Elon Musk has had to inherit. But I'm wondering if by the time this case gets to court, whether Elon Musk will still be a thing. I do hope he's got good security. And I do hope that he has good legal counsel to defend his policies on Twitter, now freer than it has ever been, though not yet free enough. And so we're running a poll on it. Will the deep state bring down Elon Musk over Ukraine? Well, you can vote on my Telegram channel, t.me George Galloway, on my Twitter account, on X, on the YouTube community poll, and on the YouTube stream. If you are on the YouTube stream watching this show, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, as long as I've still got it. And like the show if you like it. You can vote yes or you can vote no. Will the deep state bring down Elon Musk over Ukraine? Because in the end, that's what so much of everything is now all about. Phone numbers, if you want to comment on what I've said or didn't, then if you're in the UK or Ireland, it's entirely free of charge. It's 08 081 96 5522. 08 081 96 5522. If you're in the US or Canada, equally toll free, it's +1 844 944 3344. That's +1 844 944 3344. If you're in the rest of the world, it's 44 203 966 2625. 44 203 966 2625. Get dialing now. You might end up on the show. Well, one man who has had a long time season ticket in the inner circles of British politics, in the Parliament itself, and as a distinguished commentator, author and writer, and also an expert on Ireland, about which I want to touch on briefly, is Kevin Marr, who joins us here on the Mother of All Talk Shows. Kevin, welcome back to
Evening,
the
George.
show. I promise you we'll come to the Northern Ireland situation, but I wondered if you were as unimpressed by the Conservative conference today and yesterday in Manchester as I have been.
It's been a very flat week at the governing party. Rishi Sunak's speech today, I don't think, caught the gravity of where the country finds itself. I think that's how I would start by summing it up. Sunak in power as Prime Minister for just 12 months after the dismal interregnum of his predecessor, Liz Truss, and the hiatus and the huge economic damage that was caused by her 49-day premiership last year. So this is Sunak setting his stall out as he saw it, introducing himself, Sunak the man as well. No, it was a fluent performance. You can't take that away from him. He's pretty fluent. But this was a pretty content-free address. As I say, given the gravity of the issues that the country faces, we're in a cost of living crisis. We've got negligible economic growth. He did actually at one point boast that Britain had the fastest growth in the G7, which is a classic in the kingdom of the blind. The one-eyed man is king. We've got 0.3% growth at the moment. So whoopee day. He didn't address the crisis in our public services, particularly in the National Health Service, where we've got 7 million people waiting for elective treatments. Partly as a backlog, obviously, of COVID, but actually the problem stems from huge chronic underinvestment in the NHS for the best part of the last 13, 14 years. Of course, that's the paradox. Sunak is the man who's the new face, if you like, but the Conservatives have been in power since May 2010, 13 years. So what Sunak was trying to pull off today, I think, was, if I can call it this, the John Major trick, which is, of course, John Major, as you will well know, George, replaced Mrs. Thatcher after 11 years and went on 18 months later to win the 1992 general election. And I think Sunak's trying to do something similar, which is to say, we've had a long period where other people were running the show. You can't blame that on me. I'm a new face. Why don't you give me a chance? And that was very much, I think, the tenor of his pitch today, which is to try and emulate what John Major managed to pull off by winning the 1992 general election.
Well, I recall that general election, of course, very vividly, and John Major did poll the largest number of Conservative votes ever polled by anyone, including his rather more illustrious predecessors, Churchill, Thatcher. He beat them all. He did it with a soapbox, literally, and an old-fashioned bus, coach, we used to call them. He's no John Major, though, is he?
He's not. I mean, Rishi Sunak is a bit of a curiosity. He's in that classic phrase, he's risen without trace. We could have a situation here where Rishi Sunak, having first been elected in 2015 to the House of Commons, leaves it by 2024 if he doesn't win the next general election. He's a classic global citizen. He was a non-dom in America for a period. He studied abroad. He's a man of means, clearly, and his wife is obviously super rich. So there's a slightly jarring tone when you address your party and, by definition, the country, and you've got nothing to say about the cost of living crisis that is crippling ordinary families in this country. Millions of people wondering by Christmas whether they're going to be turfed out of their homes because of high interest rates. We've got soar away problems with inflation, particularly food inflation and fuel inflation. And of course, the weather's starting to turn as well, which means we enter that very difficult period for the National Health Service as well. So as I say, the gravity of the problems that Britain faces, if you've been down from Mars and listened to Rishi Sunak speak for an hour in Manchester today, you would have thought, well, everything seems to be going pretty well in this place. And of course, that's very far from reality. And that, of course, is emphasised by the fact that his party is between 16 and 19 points behind in the opinion polls, and has been for quite some time. So this was, I think, for the Conservatives, a kind of make or break conference. We saw an awful lot of show ponying by some of Sunak's colleagues who are looking to succeed in potentially even next year. So there's a lot of ill discipline in the Conservative Party. Liz Truss, his predecessor, came and spoke to a packed room about her sort of radical thoughts on economic deregulation, which, as I say, nearly crippled the country last year. So she's not gone away, and some of his other colleagues are looking to succeed him as well. So it's a party in a bit of a mess. Governing the country, I think, that is in a real mess. And as I say, I just don't think his address today, and I think it will start to unravel in coming days, was equal to the challenges that Britain faces.
Well, he's not Snow White, but the seven dwarves are there trying to succeed him. I lived in a time, Kevin, when 10 of Harold Wilson's cabinet would have been more than capable and highly recognisable to the public to succeed him in the afternoon. And most of them were trying to do just that almost every afternoon. I could rattle them off, but only you and I would remember them. This is a cabinet of dwarves. I mean, if Liz Truss is regarded as a papabile, could be Pope again, then it's a very barren field, isn't it?
It is. It's extraordinarily weak. We seem to have an age now where cabinet ministers come and go. As I said, rise without trace. Often, usually in my line of work, you track the form of the ponies to make sure you understand who they are and where they've come from. And it is a desperately unimpressive Conservative front bench. And of course, that's reflective of the fact that they've been in power for a very long time, and you end up basically at a point, particularly with junior ministers, where it becomes Buggins' turn. And that matters because, the longer you're in power, the less things work for you. You end up, in a sense, and this is where Sunak is a little bit today, repudiating your own government's past. He's trying to say today, look, this terrible sort of situation, he's going on about politics is broken. And he's like, well, seriously, you've been in power for 13 years. Who's broken it? His two signature moves today, which were announced, over coming weeks again, because the centre is breaking down. These were well trailed because they were leaked. Was scrapping HS2, High Speed Rail 2, which is supposed to go from London Euston to Birmingham and then on to Manchester, and then it was supposed to go on to Sheffield and Leeds. Now, they scrapped one part of the Y route last year, and the assumption was that the route to Manchester was at least safe. And of course, that's what's been scrapped today. So Sunak has done this because he thinks it's a waste of money. It's gobbling up too much public money. His predecessors, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Theresa May, and George Osborne, who was Chancellor, of course, for the first 6 years of this Conservative government, implacably opposed to scrapping HS2. So Sunak's here kind of repudiating what his own party has done in government. And I think that's a very dangerous moment for a party government to kind of say, we've kind of gone around in a big circle and we're going to go again in a completely different direction. It talks about the lack of intellectual coherence, I think, that afflicts the Conservative Party at the moment. You've got lots of strands, right-wing populism. You've got a kind of one-nation tradition that's trying to reassert itself, and you've got managerial MBA Rishi Sunak, who sort of comes along and sort of says, "Let me try and fix problems and run things a bit better." Except, he said a few months ago that he had 5 key priorities: reducing inflation, interest rates, growing the economy, sorting out the NHS, and the small boats issue with migrants coming across the English Channel. And on pretty much any one of those measures, he's miles away at the moment. Now, inflation will start to fall back naturally because of international factors, so it's not really anything to do with him. And again, these 5 totemic policy achievements that he's asked us to measure him against barely were mentioned in this speech today. There's very little about the economy, very little about his government's record. I mean, it's amazing, really, that he managed to pad this out for 60 minutes. But he did manage to do that. But I sense it will start to unravel, because I mean, the key thing was this issue about HS2, which he says by cancelling the route from Birmingham to Manchester, it will save £36 billion. Obviously, an awful lot of money. Now he's saying he will reinvest that in local services and local transport priorities, rail and road, across the north and the Midlands. The only problem is he starts rattling off in his speech places that are likely to benefit. But some of these places have already been previously announced. It's the classic thing of bundling together and repackaging something you've already announced. And again, that's the hallmark of a government that's lost kind of internal coherence and doesn't really have an awful lot to say for itself and to give people a real justification for voting for them for another 5 years. And I think that is what today will symbolise, that the cupboard is empty in terms of solid policy ideas. There's nothing in his speech about housing. There's nothing about perhaps changing the planning system to speed up infrastructure projects in the future. There's nothing about how he's going to support families through this winter as well. He's just kind of hoping that inflation falls over the winter, as I say, because mainly of international factors, and that then eases some of the cost of living pressures and also some of the industrial disputes, which again were not mentioned at all in his speech. There's a real sense of malaise in Britain at the moment. Nothing seems to work. You phone up at 8 o'clock to try and get a GP's appointment and you're 30th in the queue. You go to A&E, you stood there for 6 hours. You can't catch a train because we've got industrial disputes. And if we didn't, the train services are terrible anyway. So the real sense of kind of malaise, and this is the difficulty, that when you've been in power a very long time, who's to blame for the state of the country? Plausibly. And this is why I think we'll see next week at the Labour conference a real emphasis on
we'll have plenty. Yeah, we'll have plenty to say about the Labour conference, I assure you. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. It seems the Conservatives were disco dancing. I saw an extraordinary video of Priti Patel, remember her, bopping with Nigel Farage to "I Can't Take My Eyes Off You." They couldn't take their eyes off Farage, could they? Do you see any possibility that he'll be back into the Tory party?
It's a perfect metaphor, because I think certainly for the Conservative grassroots, they look at Nigel Farage and see a kind of lost prince. They see somebody who personifies and embodies their kind of politics, which is not only just about Brexit, but is this kind of buccaneering style of politics where there's a bit of swagger and a bit of assuredness. And when they measure Farage against, as you say, the kind of cabinet of pygmies and the kind of Rishi Sunak, who's the embodiment of managerial politics, they look at Farage and think, actually, we prefer a blast of the old religion. We prefer somebody that can actually put a few words together and speaks from the heart and leads from the front. So Farage, is welcomed, as I say, like the proverbial lost prince at this conference, albeit by all accounts not huge numbers of people on the ground at this conference, which is quite striking. But in a sense, his job is done, because he's managed to influence British politics to such a degree that the mainstream, really, of the Conservative Party dances to his tune. And in a sense, his work is done. So I'd be very surprised if he ever took up the offer of a plush, safe seat to get into the House of Commons, because in some respects, the stage is too small for him, given the impact that he's had on British politics in the last 10 years.
Yeah, I understand that feeling. Kevin, what about poor Northern Ireland? Left with the DUP against the world. What's going to happen there?
Well, everything is going to hinge on the next 3 weeks. There's a meeting tomorrow night of the DUP's, the Democratic Unionist Party's officer class, where we're told that Jeffrey Donaldson, the leader of the DUP, and he has many supporters that I think recognise that the boycotting of the Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive is a counsel of despair. It doesn't lead anywhere for unionism. And I think they would rather go back in at this stage with a few more concessions that the British government can perhaps winkle out of the position that it's got, because it can't do very much about the DUP's core demands, scrapping the Windsor Framework or the Northern Ireland Protocol as was. That ship has sailed, and I think the DUP kind of liberals, if I can put it like that, it's perhaps an oxymoron, liberal DUP types, but I think they recognise, we can't just hang outside because we've got an NHS that's crashing. We're getting the blame for the collapse of public services and one thing and another. It's going to lead to political repercussions at some point. So they've got this officer class meeting tomorrow, and they're 120 key people. And I think Donaldson is going to try and float across, look, we need to try and think seriously about how the choreography is how we go back in. Now, in a couple of weeks' time, on Friday the 13th, so obviously what could go wrong, it's the DUP's annual conference. And I think that's the crunch point. Because I think what we'll see is the British government try and, as I say, confect a little bouquet of micro measures that might allow Donaldson to say, look, we've managed to win some more concessions from this Windsor Framework. We now have to own these and we need to go back in. Because what happens then in a week and a half after that is the US-led investment conference that President Biden has organised and promised when he was over in Northern Ireland in May for the Good Friday Agreement celebrations. Now, it would be, I think, a perverse outcome if you ended up with US investors, possibly with checkbooks open, metaphorical checkbooks open, looking to invest, and there is nobody running Northern Ireland for them to meet. And it's a humiliation for Northern Ireland, but really this would be a humiliation for Rishi Sunak, because in 18 months' time, if the opinion polls are correct and Rishi Sunak is on a hiding to nothing and he's booted out, Rishi Sunak is going to be looking for an international job of some sort. And he's going to want to go to President Biden, assuming President Biden is still there or his administration. And if he can say, look, I delivered Northern Ireland a restoration and I managed to fix that problem, that puts him possibly in a reasonable position. If he can't deliver, then he's the man who can't deliver. And the one thing American politicians abhor is people who can't deliver. And so I think there's a lot of pressure behind the scenes from the top of British politics to say to Jeffrey Donaldson and the DUP leadership, this is crunch time. Carrying on this boycott leads absolutely nowhere. And if we don't get the restoration of the Assembly and the Executive, the British government will start to deal with the Irish government, and we will have some kind of joint stewardship of Northern Ireland, which the Unionists will hate as well. So that they're in this situation where the position they're in is not great, but their position can get worse. And of course, one of the provisos in the Good Friday Agreement is the border poll, is the referendum on Northern Ireland's constitutional status. And I think what starts to happen is if Northern Ireland is seen to be a place that cannot function, that timeline about when we get to that border poll just gets nearer and nearer. So the DUP and Unionists are in a kind of, they can't win here because the border poll gets nearer. Joint stewardship of some sort starts to take shape if Northern Ireland can't succeed. And this boycott, this nearly 2-year boycott of the Assembly and the Executive has led nowhere. All it's done is see public services in Northern Ireland decimated and decline. And as I say, they're starting to get the blame for that. So Donaldson's a realist. He's been around Westminster a long time. He can see that actually the ground beneath their feet is crumbling. So I think he probably wants to fight to do a deal, but he needs some support to get across that line. So it's up to the Northern Ireland Office, number 10, the leadership of the DUP, to do what they need to do in terms of the choreography for getting us across the line, get Stormont back up and running just before the Americans touch down on their plane. And I think it's achievable, because I think the stakes of not making this happen are so great for everybody that I think the reality will bite.
Friday the 13th, huh? As you say, what could possibly go wrong? Kevin Marr, as always, thank you for that tour de force. Let me take a quick break, and then it's your calls all the way to the hour. And in the second hour, the one and only Brian Berletic. You don't want to miss him. Stay tuned. As I say, how lucky we are to have the audience that we do. 1 million people every week watching all or part of the mother of all talk shows, and most attentive to what they hear, and many of them truly brilliant students. It's quite humbling, actually.
Oh, George, blessings upon Ukrainian. It's the metamorphosis, man, or metamorphosis, the intimations of immortality experiences. George, I like what you said. I love a lot of things you're saying. You know, your daily communion with God is through your conscience. I wanted to comment on that. That's beautifully said.
Your Socratic method on the on-air university is very beneficial, and I can only speak personally. I have appreciated, because I had called last time in regard to the general strike, and you helped to really refine my understanding of that from a different point.
The alternative point of view. When I heard that last week, and again today, I had this kind of visceral gut reaction to it. And I know what you mean by that. And, you know, the MOATS audience knows what they mean by that, because we're all informed citizens. We wouldn't be here if we weren't. For the masses who don't necessarily follow geopolitics, let's say, they're going to listen to whatever the mainstream media tells them. And for them, anything that's alternative, the automatic kind of reaction is, oh, okay, it's a crackpot view, it's a conspiracy theory, it's an extreme view, when really it's not. Let's call it what it is. It's fact-based commentary.
Hello, George. Nice to talk to you. By the way, you deserve every penny you get, because you're the only person who speaks the truth over all the fake news.
I wanted to personally thank you for bringing such great guests that speak about the situation. Also, I have become more aware of people like Max Blumenthal at the Gray Zone and others who do update us with the correct information about Syria, and this has just been such a great eye-opener. So thank you.
You are the people who have stuck with this show and transformed it into a truly global university, where it can be said that every month at least 4 million people will watch this show. They're in Greece, they're in Canada, they're in America, they're in England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, they're in New Zealand, they're in Australia, they're in Norway, Denmark, Sweden, they're in Finland. They're all over the world. They're in Africa with a call from Nigeria. This is a truly global phenomenon, and that is down to you.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Okay, the phone numbers again. If you're in the UK and Ireland, 08 08196 5522. 08 08196 5522. You call us, we'll call you back, and your call won't have cost you a penny. In the US and Canada, ditto, toll free, +1 844 944 3344. And in the rest of the world, 44203 966 2625. Richard is in England, in Hertfordshire, and he's the first caller of the evening. Richard, what would you like to say?
Hello, George. Thank you for taking my call. I think, George, I think you may agree with me that we don't really live in a really truly diplomatic age, and also I think that kind of political representatives that we now have also don't have the realism of some of the people from both sides of the party, whether that be the likes of Alan Clark or Dennis Healy, who both came from opposite sides of the fence, but also understood the realities that there were out there. So my question to you would be, sir, is how do you feel that we could hold our elected representatives accountable?
Well, you push an open door with me, as you probably know. I knew Dennis Healy and Alan Clark very well, and the late Alan Clark was a very close friend of mine, and I still read his books today, reread them in many cases. He was a knight, not just literally, but metaphorically. He was an extraordinary parliamentarian. Mr. Healy, likewise, former beach master at Anzio in the Second World War. He once said to me, sitting next to me in the chamber of the House of Commons, that Murphy's Law applies. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong in a beach landing, in a military confrontation, like the white-hot heat of the invasion of Italy by the Allied forces. The fact that both of my grandfathers were fighting in the same theatre of war as him was the cause of much conversation with us. There is nobody like Alan Clark and nobody like Dennis Healy in today's Parliament. We'll talk next week about the Labour conference, but it's come to something that if Rishi Sunak and his government do survive, it will be because of the dismal, risible quality of the opposition. The only person smaller in British politics than Rishi Sunak is Sir Keir Starmer. So wooden the birds are trying to nest in him. If he stood still, somebody would paint him with creosote. He is, Tin Man. The Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz would be the best description I could make of him. Now, how did we get here is the question, Richard. How did we go from a situation where, in my own time in Parliament, one had 100 or more men and women of individual, independent mind, that when they rose to speak, nobody knew what they were going to say, and they might say the most surprising things. And oftentimes, more often than not, whether one agreed with them or not, their contribution was worth hearing. Who in their right mind sits and watches the Parliament channel on television today? I see people leaving jobs I never knew that they had, and ask my wife, who is that person? I've never seen or heard of that person. And yet they are front benchers in the government or in the opposition. It is truly a donkey derby. And that's why Farage so stood out at the Conservative conference today. Because as Kevin Marr, who very strongly disagrees with Nigel Farage on most things, if not on all things, pointed out today that Farage's persona and contribution, impact on British politics, leaves all these other dwarves trailing in his wake. And that's why they all wanted to dance with him in Manchester. Thanks, Richard, for that. YouTube comments regarding the Tory party conference. Universal Truth says, don't vote Tory or Labour. Resist, defy, and do not comply. Well, I certainly won't be voting for either of them. Bad Basil says, I made a comment in a mainstream media news video hinting that Sunak and Sadiq Khan could be deported like Shamima was. And Tom Riviere says, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. One of the best things that Voltaire ever said. And email from Kevin. The email address, by the way, is onair@moats.tv. George, listening to Sunak about HS2 amazed me. When Russia retaliates, our infrastructure will be no more, including the big white elephant HS2. Stay safe. Regards, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. Patreon comments. You know I really rely on my Patreon, patreon.com/George Galloway. Please support me on it. Guy Thomas Gnanko is a new patron. Thank you so much, Guy. Dear Gigi, I wholeheartedly appreciate your insightful perspectives on global geopolitics. As a patron from West Africa, I eagerly anticipate MOATS Africa coming on air soon. I hope it will. I hope it will. Thank you very much indeed. Hill, H-I-L, says, of course they will try to bring him down. That's Elon Musk. And only then will I believe a billionaire is really concerned about freedom of speech and the rights of citizens to know the truth and hold governments, institutions, and businesses to account. And Edgard Abd, a MOATS graduate from down under in Australasia, I'm skeptical vis-a-vis most of the hyper-rich who belong to the deep state. I hope Elon Musk is the exception. And Leslie Hope says, from the beginning, his businesses have been supported with government contracts of various sorts. His eccentricities will be tolerated as long as he is useful. So please go to patreon.com/George Galloway. Sign up. It'll cost you the price of a cup of tea in an insalubrious cafe. Now, coming up is a man who attracts huge audiences on the mother of all talk shows. He's very calm and considered, not histrionic or boastful in any way. But he knows more. In fact, he's forgotten more about war, geopolitics, and geostrategic issues than almost anybody alive in the world today. And he has steadily built up a massive following for his new atlas and his other broadcasting work. He's a former US Marine. And isn't it funny that former service people like him, like Scott Ritter, are almost always the sharpest critics of war? I'll be back right after this short break. Stay tuned for Brian Berletic. Do you know how many people watch MSNBC? If this was a normal business, it would be out of business long ago. Do you know how many people watch CNN? We are in danger of fixating too much on the liberal hegemony of media outlets with infinitesimally small viewership. This show that you are watching has 10 times the viewership, 10 times the viewership of Rupert Murdoch's Talk TV with its budget of billions. So, let's not lose hope. Let's be our own media. You're right, not everybody watches me, watches those other people that you watch. Well, it's your job, and it's everybody else's job that's watching this and agrees with me this evening. It's your job to tell as many other people as you possibly can what we are all about, how to find us, encourage them, and check up afterwards whether they took your advice, and if they didn't, encourage them all over again. Have you any idea how we would multiply if everybody watching this did that? The best part of 2 million people will watch this program over the next 7 days. If those nearly 2 million spoke to one other person, we'd be 3 million if their advice was taken. And so on and exponentially on, it is possible to go. It's in our hands. Let's do it. I can't do much more than what I'm doing. I need you, the audience, to spread the word.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Here's Brian Berletic, large as life, in the middle of the night where he is. Brian, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, the defense minister of the Netherlands, I know it sounds like an oxymoron in a country that resisted Hitler for less than 1 single day, but they have a defense minister. Of course, being achingly politically correct, it's a woman defense minister. And she said today that the money they're putting into Ukraine is a cheap way to resist Russia. It's cheap, of course, only if you hate the Ukrainian people who are dying in vast numbers for the money that is being put in order that they can satisfy themselves that they are resisting Russia. That really is the way that NATO looks at this conflict, isn't it?
Absolutely. And once again, thank you for having me on. It's always an honor and a pleasure. I think this is part of the veneer falling off of this entire proxy war the collective West has been waging against Russia in Ukraine from 2014 onward. It really has been a process of the West conditioning Ukraine into a proxy to use as a battering ram against the Russian Federation. And now we see this whole process coming full circle, all of the propaganda evaporating and their true colors finally showing. We've heard similar sentiments expressed in the United States. We've heard people in the US Congress talk about how this is a great investment, how the Ukrainians will fight to the last man, and how this is going to ultimately deter China, but deter China from doing what? Existing? And I think people should pay attention and listen and believe their ears now that we hear the actual people behind this proxy war finally saying what everyone else, what you and I have been saying for so many months since this special military operation began, that this was a proxy war all along, at the expense of the Ukrainian people, not for or in defense of the Ukrainian people.
Well, you're absolutely right about American statespeople, if we can call them that. Lindsey Graham, for example, he goes one better than the Dutch defense ministress. He says, as you've just alluded, that actually we are putting money in and weapons in for a huge loss of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians in order to deter China. So the people in Ukraine are dying for Taiwan, and the people who are paying taxes in all these ailing Western economies are paying money for Ukraine in defense of Taiwan. How's that for a three-dimensional chess?
And then it's even worse when people actually understand the realities about the status of Taiwan, how even the US State Department officially recognizes it as part of China, meaning that all of this antagonism toward China over Taiwan is actually the United States violating China's sovereignty and violating international law. The UN recognizes Taiwan as part of China. So really it is one proxy war being waged against Russia to support the beginnings of another proxy war to be waged against China. And both of these proxy wars are fought without justification. And it's a continuation of what we've seen the collective West do everywhere from Afghanistan to Iraq and from Libya to Syria. And now it's spread into Eastern Europe. Maybe you could say spreading into Eastern Europe again after Serbia. And now East Asia is under threat.
The situation on the diplomatic, political battlefield is now going very badly for NATO. That's for sure. Joe Biden looks like a dead duck. By next week, Donald Trump might be the Speaker of the House of Representatives. I'm not making that up. It's a real live possibility now. Not many people believe that Biden will fight and win the presidency next year. The new Prime Minister of Slovakia won his election on the explicit platform of no more support for the war. The Polish government, which was once in the vanguard of involvement in Ukraine, is now under fear in a pre-general election campaign, distancing itself so fast that it's all a blur. One doesn't know what they mean, what they don't mean, but the one thing's for sure, it's all bad news for Zelensky. And then we find his wife spending $1 million, $1,100,000 to be precise. I've just looked at the receipt for jewels in Cartier in New York. It all has the feel of something, a house of cards about to fall.
Precisely. That is exactly what is happening. And all of this political turmoil we see unfolding across the collective West. We hear pundits in the West claiming that this is Russia dividing the West, dividing Ukraine's allies against each other. But in reality, it is the fundamental lies that this entire conflict have been built on. They're unraveling, and with it, all of these, I guess you could say, alliances or at least relationships built on perpetuating this proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. And it's only going to get worse. The situation on the ground in Ukraine, the so-called offensive, has been raging for 4 months. It has made no progress at all against Russian positions. The West is running out of ammunition and weapons. They do not have the industrial capacity to make more. They cannot sustain this conflict. And so what are they going to do when they run out of weapons? They run out of ammunition. The U.S. at least can continue printing money out of thin air. But if you have nothing to buy with that money, what good does it do you? So now we see political turmoil. We see politicians turning toward their self-preservational instincts. And it's only going to continue unraveling into chaos in the West. And we've seen this again many, many times. We saw this all unfold regarding Afghanistan, the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Now, we had the former wife of the great Muhammad Ali on the show on Sunday, and I was thinking a lot about Ali's last great triumph over George Foreman, rope-a-dope, where he leant on the ropes and soaked up the punishment from the fearsome George Foreman before exploding and dispatching him in I promise you, an epiphany of joy. For most of us, certainly for me. Isn't that what Russia's doing now? Rope-a-dope. They have a triple line of defense along the territories they have taken. The Ukrainians are not going to even reach the first line of those defenses, never mind breach them and get through to more. Is that not a metaphor that you can recognize that at some point Russia's going to spring forward, just like Muhammad Ali, and land some knockout blows?
Absolutely. That is exactly what we're seeing. And this so-called progress that Ukraine is making, taking a handful of villages, and if you look at the maps, detailed maps, you will see that it's still taking place all within the security zone ahead of Russia's layered main defenses. At the same time, Ukraine has exhausted its offensive potential. They had a finite amount of artillery and artillery ammunition, of armored vehicles, of tanks and armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and they've gone through the majority of all of this. And the West simply has no more to give them. There was a deficiency even before the offensive was launched. And at the same time, the West is running out of weapons to supply Ukraine. Amid this offensive and onward, Russia has expanded its own military industrial production. And these are facts that you and I have talked about for months on this show. And now these are facts that finally the New York Times is reporting in the pages of its newspapers. We can read about how Russia is making 7 times more arms and ammunition than the collective West, not just the US or Europe, but them together.
No, I mean, you got to hand it to Putin. He's picked 2 new speakers in a week, a new speaker in the Canadian Parliament and a new speaker coming up in the United States, because that's the kind of absurdity they still bleat, isn't it? Anything that goes wrong for them is Putin propaganda, misleading people and so on, and that's the basis on which they then move to close down voices that they don't like, because they're reaching more and more people with an alternative view on the war. I mean, the game's up for these people, even if they have not yet conceded it.
Absolutely, and we're all in danger of that. So we can see the desperation setting in. And I remember many years ago, when I was much younger, and I remember the West always saying about these so-called dictatorships and how them banning media in their country, how that was always a sign of weakness. And now we see the West leading the world in censorship, banning media. They've uprooted all Russian media entirely within their borders. They're planning on doing the same thing with Chinese media. And what is the reason for this? Is it because Russia and China are saying anything that is untrue? I just explained how the New York Times is now saying things that we have been saying for many months, things that had been labeled as Russian propaganda. So it is absolutely desperation setting in. They're not looking at the fundamentals that are creating this and driving this problem. And until they do that, the desperation will only grow, because their problems will only grow.
I mean, the end game is not clear in the fog of war, and much of it will depend on how far Russia wants to go. But my mind's eye tells me that the end game will be approximately half of Ukrainian territory, including all of the coast and all of the east of the Dnipro, will be new parts of Novorossiya. They will effectively be part of Russia. And then the rest, it's inconceivable that the Russians could leave a NATO statelet, however much of a stump it was, in being. So there would have to be regime change in Kiev. Otherwise, you'd get what you've got in Kosovo, which is effectively NATO-occupied stump statelet, which can be activated at any point, which it currently is being activated in Kosovo, to cause problems for, in that case, Serbia, in this case, Russia. So it doesn't just end with the partition of the country, does it? It would have to end with a government in Kiev that was friendly to Russia and entirely neutral, and for all time.
Yes, I think that's a very reasonable assessment. Of course, nobody can predict the future, but we've seen many Russian leaders begin to hint toward this type of outcome. We have to remember also that even while this conflict rages within Ukraine, there are many other factors unfolding outside. Geopolitically, we are watching multipolarism rise. We're watching U.S.-led unipolarism fade. The dollar is weakening. The economies and industries of the multipolar world are surpassing the collective West. And when you add all of those things up with the situation taking place within Ukraine's borders and Russia and Ukraine fighting this conflict, I think all of these things will drive the ultimate outcome. I think the West is going to be pushed into a corner where it's going to have to make a decision. We see that the tighter they try to grip onto Ukraine, the more everything starts to unravel. Eventually, I think they're going to have to realize there are limits to their power. They're going to have to negotiate finally in good faith with Russia. All the way up until now, they have not. But I don't think they're going to be able to get away with that anymore. They're not going to be able to get away with it because Russia will not let them. And I think even the internal factors within the West will no longer make this plausible.
Lastly, Brian, and I'm always grateful for your time, especially given the hour for you. I've just made a film about Taiwan. It's in its final editing stages now. What do you see as the overarching, it's 74 years now since the People's Republic. They're very patient people. And I posed the question in my film, will China wait for the apple to fall from the tree, or will it feel that it has to shake that tree before the Americans turn it into a fortress that is an actual threat to any reunification ever with China? How do you see the relative balance of these two approaches right now?
I think that's a very good and important question. China has been extremely patient. Many people might not know this, but the United States actually has troops stationed in Taiwan. And that is the ultimate provocation, to acknowledge that Taiwan is part of Chinese territory, but then to station troops there, knowing that you have no approval at all from Beijing to do that, to openly and constantly promote separatism in Taiwan, again, while also having a one China policy. So the US is doing absolutely everything it can to provoke China. I think the reason why China has not allowed itself to be provoked is because they understand that time is on their side. Even the worst type of provocation imaginable, I think they understand that in the long term, what the U.S. is doing is not sustainable. Even if they were to try to turn Taiwan into some sort of fortress, I think eventually, in order to avoid war and the destruction of Taiwan, because frankly, that is what the U.S. is talking about and planning for, I think they will endure a lot in order to avoid conflict. They have Taiwan's best interests in mind. The U.S. does not.
Brian Berletic, as always, a tour de horizon with the man behind the new atlas, a new atlas that's being redrawn right in front of our eyes. Brian, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Will the deep state bring down Elon Musk over Ukraine? You've only got about 20 minutes left to vote, yes or no. That's what I want to hear. I'll be right back after a short break, and then it's your calls all the way to the hour.
You have to remember back in 2002, 2003, there was a wish by George Bush for regime change. That's what was driving him. Nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction, which of course didn't exist in Iraq. So they had to construct some sort of formula, some sort of cover story in order to persuade the British public that intervention in Iraq was right. Now, David Kelly, as an expert in weapons of mass destruction, knew that this was untrue. He knew that there were probably no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
That was a guy that could have brought down, the whole system.
I reckon you're chaff. You're being thrown up to divert our probing.
The Foreign Affairs Select Committee, that parliamentarian briefing, think that was an indignity to him.
We saw it on the news, and my very first thought was shock. Oh my God, you know, this man is in the eye of the media hurricane. He should be protected by that at least.
You've got blood on your hands, Prime Minister. Are you going to resign over this?
I don't know the details of how Lord Hutton happened to be selected, but what was certainly the case is that he was the right kind of judge to use from the point of view of Downing Street and the intelligence services as well.
Of the 21 days of hearing, only one half of one day was spent on discussing the forensic aspects. That is disgusting.
We were given the Hutton report the day before. It was published. But actually what happened was he went too far.
The events of 2003 were disgraceful ones in this country's history, and it's unfinished business. Those responsible for an illegal war, those responsible for the death of David Kelly, have not been brought to justice. There's been no inquest into David Kelly's death. There needs to be one. We need to make sure that those who behaved in a reprehensible way in 2003 are finally brought to book.
Now, the fastest way to see my film Killing Kelly is to support me on Patreon, where it is available absolutely free of charge. How's that for value? So if you join me now on patreon.com/George Galloway, you get to see Killing Kelly free. And I promise you, based on what everyone who's seen it says, you'll find it a very, very interesting and important film. I made a talk when I was on about lawfare earlier, about this quite extraordinary business. Max Blumenthal is tweeting about it right now. I've just retweeted it. Bernie Sanders got 10 anti-war activists arrested at his office for holding up paper placards on which was written Bernie Sanders' own words, calling for a peaceful end and a negotiated end to the war in Ukraine. That's Bernie Sanders getting people arrested for a silent protest of people bearing aloft his own words. I mean, as Joe Biden said on the appointment of Rashid Sunak, go figure, Bernie Sanders. Simon is in Florida. He's a professor, he's a sage, he's a legend of the mother of all talk shows. Simon, go ahead, sir. What would you like to say?
Well, Mr. Galloway, we're experiencing quite an odd season now in America. We have all the Trump goings on, and obviously the vacating of the seat of the Speaker of the House of Representatives, which was the first time in American political history. But the Chinese have been taking a very strong stance, using quite bold language, to be honest, against the report that was put out by a State Department division that's called the Global Engagement Center. Now, there's a chap in Florida who's quite well renowned across the United States for doing research into government-instigated online censorship, kind of like some people might suggest is on the verge of occurring in the United Kingdom, courtesy of your wonderful regulators, who shall remain nameless, of course. Mm-hmm. And so they've put out a report very much challenging the Chinese, saying that they're engaged in information manipulation, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and every other version of cognitive warfare that you could have dredged up in the last 100 years. But we've had our Secretary of State at the State Department decide that they also wanted to engage more with the world via American culture, if such a thing exists, and music. And he chose because it turns out he's rather a decent amateur musician, to sing a song about voodoo magic. And I'm not exaggerating. The songwriter, Willie Dixon, who wrote the song for Muddy Waters in the early 1950s, in his biography, specifically said the song was about voodoo and witches. So we find ourselves in the months of Halloween with a Friday the 13th due to occur in a few days, with our Secretary of State singing about voodoo, and then the Chinese response to Mr. McCarthy losing his seat by a vote of 216 to 210 yesterday in the House of Representatives, which was unprecedented. The Chinese, and I appreciate this to be a coincidence, but it's an odd turn of events. I was reciting on my podcast that I'm involved just last night, called At Weaponized News, the witch's chant from Macbeth, because I was following this series of coincidences. But the Chinese said, and this was a gentleman called Mr. Zhang, quote, U.S. politics is now entering an era of a host of demons dancing in riotous revelry.
That's Macbeth.
And literally the day before that, I was citing the witch's chant from Macbeth. You know, ball, toil and trouble, gathering around the cauldron, all that kind of stuff. So it just seemed an extraordinary turn of events. But in the other response from the Global Times in particular to this very detailed allegation against China trying to take over the world via disinformation and propaganda, they responded to that. And this is the strongest response that I've seen anywhere out of any form of media, I would say, in regards to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. They said, and this is quote once again, Chinese in the Global Times responding to the allegations made against them, they said, think about how U.S. political elites and media outlets uniformly bleat the word unprovoked in reference to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, despite the fact that the conflict was not only provoked, but was deliberately provoked by NATO's eastward expansion. So they're basically saying a lot of things the world is thinking and nobody dares to say because they don't want the backlash from America. That inhibition, for some reason, seems to have completely disappeared as we're literally in the countdown to the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative Forum, the nature of which has been changed. And despite the fact that over 110 countries, whose names they've so far kept secret, are due to attend, which must require an enormous number of hotels and facilities to be arranged, the entire matter is being kept under wraps, and they haven't even confirmed the starting date. So there's a lot of diplomatic shenanigans afoot, despite the fact that we're now in Golden Week in China and everyone in theory is on vacation.
Now, Simon, I appreciate it's breaking news. The story emerging in Washington is that Donald Trump has been nominated for the now vacant position of Speaker of the House of Representatives, and has indicated a willingness to take that position. And as we speak, the Democratic Party is going into meltdown over the possibility, a year before the presidential election, of having Trump back in the Capitol, in D.C., in the bully pulpit, and being able to direct events vis-a-vis the Department of Justice, the Hunter Biden affair, the impeachment of Joe Biden, and so on. I mean, can this really happen?
technically it could. So Stephen Scalise, who you may recall was almost assassinated at a baseball match a few years ago. I think he was struck like 7 times, a miracle that he survived. He allegedly is rather poorly with cancer, but he's put his name in the ring. Mr. Jordan, who has been one of these people very much pursuing legal lines of inquiry regarding the Bidens, to put it very gently, he's put his name in the ring. There are obviously a considerable MAGA crowd who would be keen to see Mr. Trump in such a position. That was actually suggested before Mr. McCarthy was elected to the speakership. And you will recall that took 15 rounds of voting, which was, I believe, unprecedented, certainly in the last 120 years. And so he scraped into that position, didn't fulfill many of his positions, has now had the shortest tenure since 1876. He's now being asked if he's actually going to resign from the House of Representatives entirely, which would reduce the Republican majority, which is very, very thin indeed, to an even smaller extent. So the answer to your question is it's theoretically possible, but whoever eventually ends up winning is going to have to get, depending on the absences due to sickness and the other issues that are surrounding Representative Santos and also Representative Gates, because it shouldn't be forgotten that even though the Department of Justice stopped their inquiries into Representative Gates from Florida, one of his close associates was convicted regarding matters that did appear to pertain to Mr. Gates as well. So even though he wasn't criminally pursued, the Ethics Committee, in much the same way that, say, Boris Johnson was investigated, right, have been taking a close look into Mr. Gates. And it seems that with the issuing of that report was imminent. So he struck against the Speaker and called the motion to vacate into question literally days before it was possible that he might not only have been expelled from the House of Representatives himself, but if that weren't to occur, then he could have been expelled from the party, in much like Andrew Bridgen was chucked out the Conservative Party. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, which obviously is not uncommon in politics. I'm not sure that there's a great deal of advantage for Mr. Trump. It's important to remember that most of the financial bills have to originate in the House of Representatives, so they have what is called the power of the purse. Now, the really big issue, and this is the reason why the Democrats may be going slightly doolally, is Trump, like Mr. Kennedy, have both indicated that they think that American support for Ukraine should be significantly reduced. And so if he were in the position that he would simply refrain from calling aid bills for Ukraine forward for a vote, then that could really put a great hindrance on the continuing transfer of money. But I note, though, that Finland have just said they're going to give Ukraine 2 billion euros, and I'm not sure if you'd had the occasion to do the mental arithmetic, but that works out at $390 for every man, woman, and child in Finland in one go. And when you do the calculations for the working population, the people who have got jobs and paying taxes, it comes to almost $1,000 each when you exclude all the non-working people and the seniors and the children and so forth and the babies. So they're still getting quite a lot of support from the European Union. But we've got this meeting in Granada happening tomorrow and the next day, and we've just had the meeting of all of the EU foreign ministers in Kiev called by Joseph Borrell, with the exception of the Hungarians and the Poles, who refused to go. And Mr. Borrell made the extraordinary statement. He came out at the end of the meeting with the Ukrainian foreign minister, Mr. Kuleba, and he said that now, not because they were being rejected per se, but because of technical deficiencies with all of the other countries' peace plans, including the African Union and the Pope and the Chinese and the Israelis and the Turks, all of their peace plans were discarded. And he, quote, said, the only game in town globally, which is a slightly odd turn of phrase, but essentially the only game in town, is now the 10-point Zelensky peace plan that you and I discussed after he pushed it so hard at the United Nations about 10 days ago. So, instead of avenues being opened and there being more willingness to negotiate and more flexibility, things are being focused much more onto the head of a pin, at the same time as you've got GrantShapps, or as you would say, whatever name he happens to be going by this week, our UK defence minister, actually, suggesting that British forces, irrespective of the wishes of Parliament, are on the verge of being publicly deployed as opposed to secretly deployed to Ukraine.
Yeah, although he was slapped down by little Corporal Rishi Sunak. I could talk to you all night, Simon, but I better push on. Thanks indeed for that tremendous survey of the scene. Simon, professor of ours in politics in Florida. Some YouTube comments. The Naughty Kitten says Russia is high class and civilized. They treat prisoners of war humanely. And Jack Klugman, great name, says Ben wants the Volkssturm, teen boys and old men, severe Berlin bunker vibes on the SME drugs. This is true. Little BenWallace, who's such a gutless coward, he failed to show up to debate against me at the Oxford Union. As my friend Ian Puddock points out, the Ministry of Defence officials explained to Ian Puddock, well, you can hardly blame him for that. Well, I did blame him, do blame him. If you are one of these armchair generals that is sending and demanding be sent old men and young boys into battle, and they're almost certain death or wounding, then you kind of ought to be able to summon the courage to discuss it at the Oxford Union against me. Kurt Boss says it's truly abhorrent to watch these fools pretend to save Nazo-Ukraine. It's odious. And Frankie says Zelensky's wife spending millions while Ukraine soldiers are dying in their thousands. Those who aren't dying are starving on the battlefield. And don't forget about the Russian soldiers who have died. Thank you, Frankie. Hong Luong says America only has its own self-interest, not Taiwan's, not Ukraine's, and not anyone in the Five Eyes, AUKUS, or NATO. Entirely correct. Andy is in Detroit, Michigan, on Ukraine and the Canadian Nazis. Go ahead, Andy.
Yes, how you doing, George? The last time I spoke to you was on Father's Day.
By the grace of God, I'm good. Thank you. Okay, thanks very much, Andy. Thanks for calling back.
What I'm calling about. Hello?
Yes, Andy, go ahead.
Well, what I'm calling about is, why is Israel silent about what happened in Canada's parliament, and why did it take so long to respond to it, and why doesn't anybody from the Jewish community in Europe have a voice about what's going on there? So
well, let's
I'm
be
just
grateful
wondering-
for let's be grateful for small mercies, however slowly they come. Ukraine has lodged an official protest this evening because Israel has ended the free medical treatment of Ukrainian refugees in Israel. Israel has been ambivalent about this conflict from the beginning. Partly, I'm sure, because of the literally atrocious role played by the Ukrainian nationalists in alliance with the German Nazi forces during the occupation, immediately after Operation Barbarossa was launched, and indeed within hours of the Nazi forces crossing the Ukrainian frontier. And partly because Israel has a good relationship with Russia, albeit a complicated one. There are many Israelis in Russia. There are many Russians in Israel. There's visa-free travel between the two countries, a lot of investments in both economies by Russians and Israelis. So Israel has been ambivalent about this conflict from the beginning. It is simply not true that there has been no voice from European Jewish organizations about the atrocity in Canada, what will come to be known as the Canadian atrocity. First of all, this story was broken by Jewish people in Canada. This story was broken by Jewish people, very brave Jewish people in Ukraine itself. I don't want to give their names. Those of you who follow these things will know them, but they are literally at risk of their lives speaking up against the Bandera pro-Nazi forces within Ukraine. It's also true that the Friends of the Wiesenthal Center, not the center itself, but the Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center were amongst the first to blow the whistle on this. I'm taking a very close interest in it because I was the person who brought this subject first to the global audience. First with my 5 million view tweet on Sunday morning, a week past Sunday, and secondly with the broadcast that I did that evening on the mother of all talk shows. It was only after these two things that this became an international story, but it was a story in Canada because of brave Jewish people in Canada. And it was a story in Canada because it had been highlighted by brave Jewish people in the Ukraine. So I'm second to nobody as a critic of Netanyahu's government, but we mustn't criticize them unjustly and when it is contrary to the truth. It was, of course, 87 years ago today that the Jewish community in London, in the East End, in a constituency I later came to represent in the British Parliament, in Cable Street, it was 87 years ago today that the Jewish community in the East End of London, led, it has to be said, not by Labour people, they were told to stay at home, led by trade unionists and communists. And the Communist Party was extremely strong in the East End of London and amongst Jewish people at that time when they made their stand in what became known as the Battle of Cable Street. Cable Street in Bethnal Green became the scene of a pitched battle where the Nazi leader, Sir Oswald Mosley, who wanted to be Britain's Hitler, and his followers, supported by the police, determined that they had the right to march wherever they liked in Jewish communities in support of Nazism when Jews were already on their way to the gas chambers in occupied parts of Europe, rather in Germany proper after the passing of the discriminatory laws, the forcing of Jews to wear yellow stars on their garments, the desecrations of Kristallnacht, the destruction of Jewish property, shops, the painting of the Star of David on the windows of all their businesses and so on. At that very time, the British police were insisting that Sir Oswald Mosley, Britain's would-be Hitler, had the right to march down Cable Street, but the people decided otherwise, and they stopped them. They shall not pass was their slogan, and they did not pass. Email from Enrique. George, did you know that since 1991, the US have been involved in 215 conflicts around the world, compared to Russia's 5, all of which were on their borders? So tell me, who are the warmongers and the imperialists? Great show. Great email, Enrique. Even I didn't know that stat. Norma from Bristol is up next after this quick break. On the line is a Rose in Texas. I was at the beginning of a song on Californication, which is a song. Rose, welcome to the show.
Fan of the show, transgender fan of the show, and I wanted to briefly address your monologue from last week on Californication, because I almost entirely agree with what you said. Trans women athletes taking medals and records, directing children at nightclubs, and even going to elementary schools themselves, not to mention hormone blockers for children as well. The attack on freedom of speech, not only against conservatives, but anyone who doesn't fall in line with the agenda, rainbow flags on NATO military aircraft, which is certainly doing more to cultivate anti-queer sentiment around the world than there already is. All of that makes me sick. So because I don't believe in incest, bestiality, necrophilia, and pedophilia, I'm basically culturally right-wing by today's standards, even though less than 5 years ago, I'd still be left-wing. So in regards to you and everyone else watching who thinks of me and people like me as the villains right now, you should know that I support the most traditional Muslim, Jewish, Abrahamic believers to be as homophobic and transphobic as they want, because guess what? That's freedom of religion, which is a value we claim to have in the West. Now, my religion, I suppose, is I believe I'm a woman, but guess what? Not everyone has to convert to my religion. Otherwise, we basically have a theocracy, only this theocracy is for the ever-evolving LGBTQIA supercalifragilisticexpialidocious club. So that's all I wanted to get out my system. Thank you.
Well, Rose, if I could put your call in a glass bottle and ship it around the world, I promise you that I would do so. Crystal clear, beautifully expressed, and I wish you every happiness in life. It is exactly what people who are transgender should be saying. And if they were, they would disappoint the liberal zealots who want to use them as a battering ram against the traditional family values of the rest of us. Beautifully expressed, Rose. I'll never forget it.
You are listening to the mother of all talk shows with George Galloway.
Ah, Rose in Texas, fragrant still. Still more fragrant is the wonderful Norma in Bristol, a legend. Now she's on the line. Norma, what would you like to say?
Hello, George. No, I wanted to just bring to your attention about China, because I've been watching a lot of sport that's been there, and it's been so refreshing. They first of all had a China Open snooker, which was good to watch. But now we've got the tennis. There's been tennis in Beijing and in Shanghai, and you know the hospitality that the Chinese actually have given us, it's been really a joy to watch, because just for once there's no politics. It's just been a sort of feel-good factor there, and it's another refreshing angle instead of all this about Taiwan and China and wars. So I just thought I'd put another angle on it.
It's a very important angle, and one that I've been following myself. China has a population of 1.5 billion people. So if they take up any sport seriously, they stand a very good chance of sweeping the world with it. And the first place I saw that happening, I know you're a tennis fan, Norma, and I'm not particularly, was in snooker. I misspent much of my youth in the snooker halls in Scotland. So I follow the game very closely, and I began to see more and more and more brilliant Chinese snooker players. And of course, there's so many Chinese to choose from that the Chinese snooker cohort is beginning to sweep all before it. And as you pointed out to me some time ago, they're now doing the same in China, in tennis rather, in China. And again, if you've got 1.5 billion people and everyone really gets stuck into the old tennis racket, you're going to sweep the boards, and that's going to happen. The only thing that hasn't worked so far is football in China. As you know, Norma, I spend a lot of time in China. I would have moved my entire family there with me, but for the fact that my son, Torren, is a football protege with a very real shout of making it as a professional in the professional game. And so I asked around, why hasn't football taken off in China? And the answer I got was a rather sobering one. It's corruption. It is gambling. Because the Chinese are also very enthusiastic gamblers.
I know.
The possibility of tampering with the outcome of football matches is a very real one. Otherwise, Torren would have been playing for Shanghai United already, never mind Manchester United. Last word from you, Norma.
Well, I just thought it was a different angle. And the last word from me basically is, I just wanted to point out that my husband's got 10 weeks only of the NHS government money for his end-of-life care. After that, we'll have to be means-tested. But my daughter-in-law and me are going to see some nursing homes tomorrow, and hopefully he'll be more comfy in a nice nursing home than staying in hospital. So that was the update on him.
It is, well, I'm glad you updated us. I didn't want to ask you in case you didn't want to talk about it, but it's really come to something when we've got money, billions, to send to a war which has nothing to do with us in the Ukraine, to decide whether Kupiansk is on one side of a line on a map or other, when it's been in 4 different countries in the last 100 years. We've got unlimited money for that. But Norma's husband now has 10 weeks to die. If he dies within 10 weeks, it'll cost the family nothing other than the taxes they've paid all of their life into the British Exchequer, which promised from the cradle to the grave care in a national health service free at the point of use. But Norma's husband has to die within 10 weeks or face the prospect that his widow and his children will be potentially bankrupted by having to pay for private care for their husband and for their father. If I sound angry about that, I could not be more angry about that. Norma, I'm sorry. I hope I haven't upset you. Let's read this email from Wayne. Good evening, George. Is there any reason why we could not rid ourselves of the first past the post election system and replace it with a proportional representation election system? If so, would that not go some way to bringing about more balance? Well, of course, Wayne, and I have supported that all of my political life. I even pointed out to Mr. Blair and Mr. Brown when they were enjoying landslide election victories, but not a landslide victory in the percentage of the vote, but landslide electoral majorities. Now you should legislate for proportional representation. And you can defend it by saying, we are doing this even though it is against our interest. Because if you introduce proportional representation, there would never be a Rishi Sunak premiership again, or a Boris Johnson premiership again. Because the great majority of British people don't vote for the Conservative Party. They got an 80-seat parliamentary majority on a minority of the vote, even though they were facing the incredibly maligned Jeremy Corbyn. So, yes, of course, that's what we should do. But we will not do it because it would require the people who are in Parliament right now on an unfair electoral system that got them into Parliament. We would be counting on them to legislate to put themselves out of business, parliamentary business at least, and they will not, I promise you, do that. Comments on Patreon from MN Nazim, commenting on Tony Blair, says, all the leaders of the Western world will be encouraged by the money Tony Blair is making. They will all be encouraged to venture into weak nations and kill the innocents and make a killing thereafter. Sickos. That is indeed the thesis of my film, The Killings of Tony Blair. If you haven't seen that yet, you really need to get the full SP, as we say. Quack Quacks says this expose of Blair says everything that is necessary to convict him of the most major war crimes that can be committed. We just need the sentence to be announced and acted upon. Now, I better tell you about the poll. On Telegram, 43% thought the deep state would bring Elon Musk down. On Twitter, only 36% thought so. On the YouTube community poll, 37% thought so, and on the YouTube stream, 41% thought so. So most people think that the deep state will not bring down Elon Musk. But a substantial minority, Mr. Musk, seem to think that they will, or at least might. Thank you, all of you who voted. Thank you, all of you, for being here for the mother of all talk shows this evening. We had difficulties with the telephone lines, and that's why most callers tonight didn't get through. But if you were one of those that tried, I promise you that we will prioritize your call on Sunday at 7 p.m. UK time for the mothership, the original mother of all talk shows. I don't know if Donald Trump will, in the end, go for the speakership of the US Congress as an observer of political theater. Of course, I would be very delighted if he did so. It would make the next 12 months amongst the most entertaining and thrilling even that there has been in US politics. But he might be better advised to keep his powder dry and to continue raising big money and making big rallies all over the United States with a view to defeating all these fake lawfare issues that he is now facing, which grow more and more ludicrous by the day. The case in New York, a civil case, alleges that he inflated the value of his properties in order to obtain loans which he long ago repaid with interest, and thus no victim in this civil case exists, except a district attorney that ran for office on the promise that she would make lawfare against the then President of the United States. I feel sure that Trump will prevail over all of these things. But at the end of the day, it's not really my business, at least not directly. What is my business is that I no longer know for sure if when I get up to leave this studio this evening, there are going to be police officers at the door wishing to interview me about the contents of my speech in the course of this show. And I mean that. I am no longer sure if that will happen to me, as it's happening to more and more and more people in the United Kingdom today. My father, God rest his soul, went to his grave believing that Britain was the best country in the world, not least for the quality of its freedom of speech. I can hear him turning in his grave. Thanks for being here. I hope I'm here on Sunday, in which case join me at 7 p.m. UK time for the mother of all talk shows. And do please bring somebody with you. Follow me on every one of these platforms, because you don't know where I'm going to have to end up exclusively at the end of the day.